Hey guys, this is Mary from Chatavore. This is my first video, so if I stumble over anything, you have to promise not to make fun of me. But today, it's Labor Day, it's very rainy outside, but we're still going to celebrate with some mushroom sliders that I got from Pioneer Woman's website. And I'll be making potato rolls for my sliders out of, I'm just here for More Food by my favorite chef, Alton Brown. So you should get all of his books, they're fantastic. I've got my place marked here for potato rolls. So I'm going to be starting with a cup of whole milk and an ounce and a half of melted butter that I heated to about 120 degrees on my stovetop, and I've already done that. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh 13 1/8 ounces of white whole wheat flour, and this is my adaptation. The recipe actually calls for all-purpose flour, but I always use white whole wheat flour for all of my bread baking. I am very partial to King Arthur brand, so if you'd like to look for that, you can get it at your local grocery store. I've got my digital scale here. This is a very important tool to have when you're baking. So if you don't have one, I highly recommend that you get one. Most recipes are going to call for measurements in volume as well as weight, but I really prefer weight because it's much more precise. And Alton says that that's actually the reason that Europeans are better bakers than Americans. It's because they cook by weight and not by volume. So I'm going to weigh 13 1/8 ounces of white whole wheat flour into my bowl. This is just the mixing bowl from my KitchenAid mixer. I like to have a lot of kitchen tools, but I don't like to have too many because that becomes a storage issue. So when I'm making bread, I usually just use my mixing bowl from my stand mixer, and that kind of frees up a little bit of space that would normally be taken by having tons and tons of mixing bowls in my kitchen. So that's 13 1/8 ounces of flour. By the way, keep your whole wheat or white whole wheat flour in the freezer because it will go rancid because of the oil that is in there that's not in processed flours. The other thing that I'd like to say is that white whole wheat flour actually has just as much nutritional content as regular whole wheat, so don't be fooled by the fact that it says white. It's just as good for you. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put 3 tablespoons or about 1.5 ounces of sugar into my bowl. And I actually forgot my potato flakes. And I really kind of felt like if anybody saw me buying potato flakes at the grocery store, I was probably going to lose some of my street cred because I haven't made mashed potatoes from flakes in years, but I figured for potato rolls I could get away with it. So I've got my box of instant mashed potatoes here. I'm going to zero out my scale, and I'm going to measure 5/8 ounce into my bowl. To put 2.5 teaspoons of yeast. Like I said, this is my first video. I thought I had everything together, but I am seeing some things that I forgot to put on my table, so you'll have to forgive me when I step out of the shot. But I have 2.5 teaspoons of yeast, and I use Safe Instant Dry Yeast, and I order that from kingarthur.com. Comes in a pound bag, and I also keep it in the freezer to keep it fresh. This bag lasted me about a year, and I make bread at least once or twice a week, so it's definitely worth the money that you spend on it because it actually will save you money over what you buy in the grocery store. So I'm just going to stir that into my warm milk and butter mixture. And then I'm going to weigh in, well, no, I think I'll just use my teaspoon here to put in 2 teaspoons of salt. I don't need my scale anymore. So I'm going to mix my dry ingredients, make sure that I get them good and incorporated together. And you can see where my yeast has dissolved into my milk. So I'm just going to pour it straight in. And sometimes you'll find that when you are using whole wheat flour that you'll have to adjust the measurement on your liquids. So again, if I have to step out of the shot, I may have to add a little bit of milk or water to this just to get the moisture content perfect. But I'm going to stir this all together. The recipe actually says to use your stand mixer, but I really prefer to do my dough by hand these days because I just find that I have more control over the texture and knowing how much it needs to be kneaded or stirred if I do it by hand. So I do need some more moisture here, so I'm actually going to go to my sink and get some warm water. I'll be right back. Alright, so I got about a cup of just warmish water, and I'm just going to put it in a tablespoon or 2 at a time because I definitely want to make sure that I don't oversaturate my dough, but I also want to make sure that I have plenty if I need more. So I'm just going to, I added a couple of tablespoons, stir it up, see if I can get it all incorporated off the bottom. And you can never tell how much you're going to need. That's why I just kind of do it as I go, because some days you need more than you do on other days, and I find this when I'm using whole wheat flour for breads, pancakes, whatever I happen to be using it for. But I've got a good ball of dough here. Everything's mixed together and there's nothing left on the bottom of my bowl, so I'm going to get my kneading surface ready now. So I've got my flour. I'm just going to sprinkle some flour on my table here. And Alton does recommend that you knead on the table instead of kneading on the counter because you can get more leverage when you're bending down over a table as opposed to a counter, which is higher up and you don't have as much room to push down as you do when you're on a table, especially if you're short like I am. So I've got my floured surface here, and I'm just going to turn my dough out. Scrape that off of there and set my bowl out of the way. Now I'll just sprinkle a little bit more flour on top. And one thing that I have to say is that when you're making bread, you can't be afraid to get your hands a little bit sticky, because if you knead in too much flour so that your bread dough is completely dry, then you're going to end up with a very dry and heavy and over kneaded dough. And remember that I'm doing this in my home kitchen, so my cat Stella has come to visit us. If you hear her begging out of the shot, then you know what that noise is. She likes to come in here when we're cooking because she thinks that she might get a treat. So I just keep spreading the flour back out, making sure that my hands are floured, and when you're kneading, all you do is press down, pull in. I like to give it a turn, press down, pull in, press down, and pull in. And once you get used to this, you'll really start to recognize when you need to put more flour in, if it's really too sticky or if it's just sticky enough. And you can tell when the dough starts to really change texture and it starts to go from being ragged to being smooth. And you'll really start to recognize the more that you do this how much you need to knead. And I really tend to err on the side of under kneading as opposed to over kneading. Now, this may not be what the professionals would do, but I like a softer texture to my dough, so I try to make sure that I don't over knead it too much so that I produce too much gluten and make a loaf that's heavy and thicker than I would like for it to be. So I'm just going to keep kneading here. Alton says to knead for 8 to 10 minutes, so I won't subject you to that, but when we come back I'll have a ball of dough that's ready to go into the bowl and rise. So see you in a few minutes. Alright, so I'm just finishing up kneading my dough, and it's really to the point now where it's barely tacky to the touch, but it's not sticking to my hands. My hands are nice and clean, but it's not totally dry. There's no flour on the outside of it. I've cleaned up almost all the flour off my surface, but it's not sticking to the table. And I've got a nice clean mixing bowl over here. My very helpful husband washed it for me while I was kneading, so I'm just going to drop my ball of dough into the bowl. I'm going to cover it up with a kitchen towel, and I am going to set it over here by my stove to let it rise for a couple of hours. I'm a big fan of the slow rise method, so I usually allow my dough to rise for 2 or 3 hours before I punch it down. And depending on the recipe, I might actually let it rise twice. This recipe has one rise as a whole ball, and then you divide it into rolls and let it rise again. So that's what we're going to do. So I'll come back in a couple of hours and check on the status of my risen dough ball.